The alarm
À,
clock did
mình
not
nghĩ bạn làm được
ring.
à?
It
Cười
did
cho bạn vậy
not
thôi.
need to. Eleanor
Cút đi.
Vance was awake at precisely 0500 hours. It was a rhythm carved into her very bones. It was a
Ê, gì
biological
kìa? Học sinh
cadence
gương mẫu đây rồi.
inherited from
Gì
a
kìa? Chắc
man
lại đang ôn
who had
bài.
lived his
Ê,
entire
sao mà không
life
có
by the
tăm? Dữ
dawn.
vậy?
The bedroom was silent. The air was cold. Outside the frosted window pane, the small American town of
Hey,
Oak
it's
Creek was
okay.
still
I'm right
wrapped in the
here.
heavy,
Thanks, but you hurt.
steel-gray
We'll go
darkness
slow.
of an
Ready?
autumn morning. Eleanor pushed
À,
the heavy
bạn
wool
nghĩ bạn làm
blanket
được à?
aside.
Cười cho bạn vậy
She
thôi.
did not stretch. She
Cút
simply
đi.
rose. Her movements were economical. Every motion had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. She made the bed. The corners of the sheets were folded at perfect 45-degree angles. A military tuck. A habit she could not break, even if she wanted to. It was a quiet ritual of order in a world that had suddenly become overwhelmingly chaotic. She ran her hand over the taut blanket. It was a small act of control. Eleanor moved to the small oak dresser. She dressed in silence. A plain gray t-shirt, sturdy denim jeans, faded white at the knees. A worn olive drab jacket that was slightly too large for her shoulders. And her boots. They were leather, scuffed at the toes, laced tight. They were the kind of boots meant for walking long miles on hard ground. Then came the final piece of armor. She reached for the top of the dresser. Resting on a small, folded American flag was a silver chain. Attached to it were two rectangular pieces of dull, scratched metal. Dog tags. She picked them up. The metal was cold against her skin. Her thumb brushed over the embossed lettering. Vance, Silas, USMC. She closed her eyes. For a fraction of a second, the quiet bedroom vanished. She was standing in a manicured cemetery. The sky was weeping a cold rain. The sharp, echoing crack of a 21-gun salute rang in her ears. She felt the heavy, folded triangle of the American flag being pressed into her 14-year-old hands. The white gloves of the commanding officer. The solemn, sorrowful look in his eyes. 2 years had passed since that day. 2 years since a training accident took the only family she had ever known. But the weight of that flag never left her hands. Eleanor slipped the chain over her head. The dog tags settled against her collarbone. They were hidden beneath her shirt, out of sight, but the weight of them was a constant, physical reminder of who she was, and more importantly, of the vow she had made. She stepped out of the small, rented house and into the biting autumn wind. The walk to Oak Creek High School was 2 miles. She did not take the bus. She preferred the walk. It gave her time to secure her perimeter. It gave her time to build the mental walls she would need to survive the next 8 hours. The town of Oak Creek was an old industrial hub trying to find its footing in a modern world. The sidewalks were cracked. The oak trees that gave the town its name were dropping their brown leaves onto the wet pavement. Eleanor walked with a steady, measured stride, heel to toe, shoulders back, chin level. She did not look down. She scanned the environment. It was a passive awareness, a trait her father had drilled into her before she even knew how to ride a bicycle. Eyes up, Eleanor. His voice echoed in the cavernous halls of her memory. It was a deep, gravelly voice, a voice built for commanding respect. The ground isn't going anywhere. You watch the horizon. You watch the movement. You don't let the world happen to you. You see it coming. She saw the school coming. Oak Creek High was a massive, sprawling complex of red brick and glass. It looked less like an institution of learning and more like a holding facility. As she approached the main courtyard, the silence of her morning walk was shattered. The noise was a physical wall. Yellow buses idled, their diesel engines rumbling in the cold air. Hundreds of teenagers swarmed the concrete. It was a chaotic mess of shouting, laughing, pushing, and posturing. It was an environment of unchecked energy and absolute lack of discipline. Eleanor stepped into the current. She did not try to blend in. She did not shrink her shoulders or lower her head. She maintained her bearing. She navigated the crowded courtyard the way a ship navigates a minefield. Smooth, deliberate, untouchable. She felt the eyes on her, Small towns did not like strangers. High schools liked them even less. She was the new girl. She did not wear the right brands. She did not have the right haircut. She did not smile to disarm their judgment. She was a blank slate, and to the insecure, a blank slate was a threat. She pushed through the heavy double doors. The hallway was a canyon of metal lockers and scuffed linoleum. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glare on the chaos below. Eleanor moved toward locker number 427. She kept her breathing slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A steady 4 count. It kept her heart rate down. It kept the noise from penetrating her focus. She reached her locker and dialed the combination. 3 right, 12 left, 21 right. The metal latch clicked. Well, well, look what washed up on the concrete. The voice was loud. It was designed to carry. It was designed to draw an audience. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not turn her head immediately. She finished opening the metal door, placed her history textbook on the top shelf, and only then did she slowly turn to face the source of the noise. It was Montgomery Sinclair. He stood in the center of the hallway, flanked by 2 other boys who looked like they were constructed solely of broad shoulders and vacant expressions. Montgomery was tall. He wore a royal blue Letterman jacket with a large white O stitched over the chest. His hair was perfectly styled. His jaw was square. He was undeniably handsome, but there was a cruel, arrogant set to his eyes. He looked like a boy who had been told he was special every day of his life, a boy who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. He was the undisputed king of Oak Creek High, and a king always needed to test the borders of his kingdom. I said, Montgomery stepped closer, closing the distance to invade her personal space. Look what washed up. You deaf, new girl? Or just stupid? The hallway traffic began to slow down. The ambient noise dropped. The invisible social gravity of high school was pulling a crowd to the spectacle. They wanted blood. They wanted entertainment. Eleanor looked at him. She did not look at his face. She looked at his center of gravity. It was a tactical assessment. It happened in a fraction of a second. It was an instinct honed by thousands of hours on a canvas mat. Montgomery was leaning forward. His weight was unevenly distributed on his right leg. His shoulders were tight with forced aggression, but his core was relaxed. He was posturing. He was a house built on sand. If she wanted to, she could drop her center, pivot on her left heel, hook her right foot behind his loaded knee, and drive her palm into his chest. He would be on the linoleum in less than a second. His skull would bounce off the hard floor. The air would leave his lungs. He would be completely incapacitated. She knew the exact physics of it. She knew the precise amount of torque required to shatter his manufactured confidence. But her hand remained at her side. Her thumb pressed against the denim of her jacket, feeling the hard outline of the dog tags beneath the fabric. Never strike out of pride, Eleanor. Her father's voice was loud in her mind. They were standing in the small garage he had converted into a dojo. The heavy bag hung from a steel beam. The air smelled of chalk and old sweat. He had just swept her legs out from under her for the 5th time that evening. She had been angry. She had swung wildly, fueled by frustration. You fight angry, you die stupid, Silas Vance had said, extending a calloused hand to pull her up from the mat. Anger makes you blind. Pride makes you fragile. Your fists are not tools for your ego. They are weapons of last resort. If you can walk away, you walk away. You only engage when there is no other path. You only strike to protect. Do you understand me, Marine? Yes, sir, she had gasped, wiping the sweat from her eyes. Discipline isn't about knowing how to break a man's jaw, he had continued, his voice softening just a fraction. Discipline is having the power to do it and having the restraint to keep your hands in your pockets. True strength is quiet. It doesn't need to shout. Eleanor blinked. The memory faded. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway returned. Montgomery was still standing there, his face twisted in a mocking sneer, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to cry, to yell, to run. She offered him nothing. Her face remained a mask of absolute calm. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, held his gaze without a flicker of fear. She did not project submission. She projected a terrifying, impenetrable emptiness. Montgomery's sneer watered. Just for a millimeter. The reaction he wanted was fear. The reaction he was getting was a brick wall. It confused him. And for a boy like Montgomery Sinclair, confusion quickly soured into anger. "What's your problem, freak?" he snapped. The playful arrogance was gone. His voice was sharper now. He stepped directly into her path and forcefully bumped his shoulder against hers. It was a heavy, deliberate shove, designed to knock her off balance, to send her stumbling backward into the lockers. Eleanor shifted her weight. She absorbed the kinetic energy of his shoulder perfectly. She rooted her back foot. She didn't move an inch. The impact felt less like a collision and more like a wave breaking against a stone piling. Montgomery stumbled slightly, thrown off by her lack of momentum. He looked back at her, a flash of genuine surprise widening his eyes. Eleanor did not acknowledge the shove. She simply turned her back to him, quietly closed her locker door, spun the combination lock, and began walking down the hallway. Her stride was exactly the same as it had been when she walked into the building. Unbothered, unbroken. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. No one walked away from Montgomery Sinclair. No one ignored him, especially not a new girl with scuffed boots and a faded jacket. Montgomery stood frozen for a moment, the blood rushing to his face. His authority had been challenged, not by words or fists, but by absolute crushing indifference. His jaw clenched tight. The veins in his neck stood out. The hunt had officially begun. For the next 3 weeks, Eleanor lived in a state of siege. Montgomery Sinclair did not let the hallway incident go. It gnawed at his ego like a rat in the walls. He needed to break her. He needed to prove to the school and to himself that he was the apex predator. The harassment started small. It was a war of attrition. When she sat at her desk in geometry class, pieces of crumpled paper would strike the back of her head. When she walked through the crowded stairwells, a foot would suddenly shoot out, attempting to trip her down the concrete steps. When she left her notebook on her desk to retrieve a pencil, she would return to find the pages torn and scattered across the floor. It was a relentless, grinding pressure. It was the kind of psychological warfare that could hollow a person out. It was designed to isolate. It was designed to induce paranoia. But Montgomery Sinclair had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea he was attempting to break a mind that had been forged in the fires of Marine Corps discipline. Eleanor endured it. She endured it with a stoicism that bordered on the unnatural. When the paper hit her head, she did not turn around. When the foot shot out on the stairs, her peripheral vision caught the movement. Her stride adjusted by a fraction of an inch, and she stepped over it without missing a beat. When her notebook was destroyed, she calmly picked up the torn pages, one by one, her face completely void of emotion. She was a ghost walking through their physical world. She retreated to the farthest corners of the school. During the lunch hour, when the cafeteria became a roaring coliseum of social hierarchy, Eleanor chose the shadows. She found an empty table in the far back corner, near the heavy metal doors that led to the loading dock. It was a dead zone. The lighting was poor. The air smelled faintly of bleach and discarded cardboard. It was perfect. She would sit with her back against the cinder block wall. It was a tactical position. She had a clear line of sight to the entire room. No one could approach her from behind. She would unpack her simple lunch, a sandwich wrapped in foil, an apple, and she would eat in silence. From her vantage point, she observed the ecosystem of Oak Creek High. She watched Montgomery hold court in the center of the room. He sat at the largest table, surrounded by the athletes, the cheerleaders, the beautiful and the cruel. She watched how they laughed too loud at his terrible jokes. She watched how the smaller students navigated the aisles, keeping their heads down, terrified of drawing his attention. Montgomery Sinclair was a bully, but he was not a warrior. Eleanor knew the difference. Her father had taught her the difference. A warrior fights for a cause. A warrior protects the perimeter. A warrior understands the heavy burden of power. A bully is just a coward who uses fear to hide his own weakness. Montgomery preyed on those who would not fight back because he was terrified of a fair fight. She watched him knock a tray out of a freshman's hands. The plastic clattered against the linoleum. The food spilled in a messy, humiliating circle. Montgomery and his friends roared with laughter. The freshman scrambled to his knees, his face burning red, quickly scooping up the ruined food. Eleanor's hand tightened into a fist under the table. Her knuckles turned white. Restraint, Eleanor. She closed her eyes. She pictured the folded flag. She felt the cold metal of the dog tags against her chest. She forced her fingers to uncurl. She forced her breathing to slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The freshman was not in physical danger. It was humiliation. It was painful, but it was not life-threatening. The rules of engagement her father had set were strict. She could not intervene simply because she was angry. She could not break her oath for the sake of pride. She opened her eyes and resumed eating her apple. The taste was like ash in her mouth. It was during the fourth week that the dynamic of the battlefield shifted. Eleanor was sitting in her usual corner by the loading dock doors. The cafeteria was at its peak volume. She was reading a worn paperback novel, her mind miles away from the smell of institutional pizza and the roar of teenage gossip. A sound broke her concentration. It was a rhythmic, mechanical sound, a heavy, dragging scrape followed by a metallic click. Scrape, click, scrape, click. Eleanor lowered her book. Moving slowly through the crowded aisles was a girl. She was small, with delicate features and bright, observant brown eyes. Her blonde hair was cut in a short, practical bob. But it was not her face that drew the eye. It was her left leg. It was encased in a heavy steel and leather orthopedic brace. The girl moved with tremendous effort. Every step was a calculated struggle against gravity and her own body. She leaned heavily on a single crutch, her knuckles white with the strain. She was carrying a plastic lunch tray in her free hand, trying desperately to keep it balanced while navigating the chaotic sea of students. Eleanor watched her. The girl's name was Beatrice Caldwell. Eleanor knew this because they shared a biology class. Beatrice sat in the front row. She was brilliant. She answered the questions the rest of the class stared blankly at. But outside the classroom, Beatrice was a target. Eleanor watched as Beatrice approached the center of the cafeteria, heading toward a small, empty table near the windows. To get there, she had to pass directly behind Montgomery Sinclair's table. Eleanor's posture shifted. She leaned forward slightly. Her eyes narrowed. The tactical map in her mind flared red. Beatrice was keeping her head down, focusing entirely on the floor, trying to be invisible. But the mechanical click of her brace was loud. It was a beacon. Montgomery heard it. He stopped mid-sentence. He turned in his chair, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. He nudged the boy sitting next to him and pointed his thumb at Beatrice's approaching figure. Eleanor saw the shift in Montgomery's weight. She saw the angle of his foot moving out from under the table. It was a cowardly ambush. Beatrice took a step. Her heavy brace swung forward. Montgomery's foot shot out into the aisle. The steel of Beatrice's brace caught hard against Montgomery's expensive sneaker. The momentum of her heavy step betrayed her. The crutch slipped on the polished linoleum. Beatrice went down. It was a hard, ugly fall. She couldn't catch herself. Her lunch tray launched into the air. The plastic shattered against the ground. Milk exploded across the floor. Beatrice hit the hard tiles with a painful thud, her braced leg twisting awkwardly beneath her. A sharp gasp ripped through the immediate vicinity, and then the laughter started. It didn't start with the whole room. It started at Montgomery's table. Cruel, barking laughter. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, highly amused by his own handiwork. "Watch your step, hop along," Montgomery sneered loudly. "Floor gets slippery." Beatrice was on the ground. Her face was flushed crimson. Her bright eyes were suddenly shining with unshed tears. She didn't look at Montgomery. She frantically tried to gather her scattered food, her hands shaking, her crutch out of reach. Across the room, in the dark corner by the loading dock doors, Eleanor Vance stopped breathing. The cafeteria noise seemed to mute. The laughter faded into a dull, underwater hum. Eleanor's vision tunneled. The world narrowed down to the sight of Beatrice Caldwell, a girl whose only crime was existing, struggling on the dirty floor while a coward laughed at her pain. Eleanor's hand moved to her chest. She gripped the dog tags through the cotton of her shirt. She gripped them so hard the metal dug into her palm. She remembered the oath, only to protect yourself or someone truly helpless. Beatrice was not in mortal danger. She was humiliated. But as Eleanor looked at the tears shining in Beatrice's eyes, as she looked at the desperate, shaking hands trying to gather ruined food, she felt a tectonic shift deep within her soul. Silas Vance was a man of strict rules, but he was also a man of deep, profound compassion. He had taught her that weakness was not a physical state. Weakness was a moral failing. Weakness was watching the innocent suffer and doing nothing when you had the power to stop it. Montgomery Sinclair was not just a bully anymore. He was a cancer, and a cancer left untreated would rot the entire body. Eleanor did not stand up immediately. She did not rush across the room in a blind rage. That was how amateurs fought. That was how you lost control. Instead, she observed. She watched Beatrice finally manage to retrieve her crutch. She watched the small girl pull herself up, her face a mask of quiet devastation, and limp out of the cafeteria doors, leaving the mess behind. She watched Montgomery high-five his friend, his ego fed by the destruction of another human being. Eleanor slowly packed away her half-eaten sandwich. She zipped her worn backpack. She slung it over her shoulder. The silence she had maintained for weeks was no longer a shield. It was beginning to feel like a chain. The discipline her father had instilled in her was not designed to make her a passive witness to cruelty. It was designed to make her a surgical instrument of justice. She stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the cinder block wall. She did not look at Montgomery as she walked toward the cafeteria exit. She kept her eyes on the horizon. But the air around her had changed. The quiet, empty void she had projected for weeks was gone. In its place was a heavy, suffocating pressure. The storm was no longer brewing on the horizon. The storm had arrived. And Montgomery Sinclair had no idea that the quiet girl with the scuffed boots was holding the lightning. The hallway outside the cafeteria was empty. The linoleum stretched out like a long, polished runway under the flickering, fluorescent lights. The roar of the lunch crowd was muffled behind the heavy wooden doors, reduced to a dull, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a distant engine. Eleanor Vance walked with her eyes fixed on the floor. She was tracking the wet, irregular scuff marks left by a rubber crutch. She found Beatrice Caldwell near the stairwell leading to the science wing. The smaller girl was sitting on the bottom step. Her heavy steel and leather brace was stretched out awkwardly in front of her. Her crutch rested against the cinder block wall. She was holding a damp paper towel against her ruined blouse, her shoulders shaking with silent, suppressed heaves. Eleanor did not rush forward. She did not offer frantic, hollow words of comfort. She knew from experience that pity was a corrosive acid to pride. Pity made the victim feel smaller. Silas Vance had taught her that. He had taught her that when a soldier falls, you do not weep over them. You offer them a hand, and you pull them back to their feet. Eleanor stopped 2 paces away. She unzipped her faded backpack. She reached inside and pulled out a clean, gray flannel shirt. It was one of her father's old shirts. It smelled faintly of cedar in cold air. She held it out. Beatrice looked up. Her brown eyes were rimmed with red. Her cheeks were flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and lingering shock. She looked at the offered shirt, then up at Eleanor's impassive face. Eleanor did not smile. She simply gave the shirt a slight shake. Beatrice hesitated. Then with a trembling hand, she reached out and took the flannel. The fabric was thick. It was warm. It was a shield against the cold, clinical air of the hallway. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered. Her voice was barely more than a ragged breath. Eleanor nodded once. She sat down on the step next to Beatrice. She did not crowd her. She left exactly 12 inches of space between them, a respectful perimeter. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled laughter from the cafeteria. It was the laughter of the oblivious, the laughter of those who had never known the heavy gravity of the floor. "I hate this place," Beatrice said finally. She pulled the flannel shirt over her stained blouse. It swallowed her small frame, but it covered the humiliation. "I hate them." "Hate is expensive," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and devoid of inflection. "It costs too much energy, energy you need to keep moving." Beatrice turned to look at her. She studied Eleanor's profile. She looked at the sharp line of her jaw, the relaxed set of her shoulders. She looked at a girl who seemed to exist in a completely different atmospheric pressure than the rest of the school. "How do you do it?" Beatrice asked. Her brow furrowed. "Montgomery has been targeting you for a month. He throws things. He insults you. He tries to humiliate you every single day. And you do nothing. You don't even look angry. You just take it." Eleanor looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were calloused. The skin was thick from years of striking heavy canvas bags and wooden posts. She thought of the dog tags resting heavy against her chest. "I don't take it," Eleanor said softly. "I process it. There is a difference." Beatrice adjusted her brace with a metallic click. "It looks like taking it to me, and it looks like it's making him worse. He thinks you're weak, Eleanor." "What Montgomery Sinclair thinks is irrelevant to my mission," Eleanor replied. "Your mission?" Beatrice gave a short, bitter laugh. "We're in high school, Eleanor. We're not in a war zone." Eleanor turned her head. She looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. Her slate gray gaze was so intense, so completely devoid of typical teenage insecurity, that Beatrice instinctively leaned back. "Every place is a war zone if you are unprepared," Eleanor said. "The terrain just changes. The weapons change. A rumor can be just as destructive as a bullet if it hits the right target. My father taught me that. He taught me to control my environment by controlling my reaction to it. If I give Montgomery my anger, I give him my power. I refuse to arm my enemy." Beatrice looked at the floor. The damp paper towel was crumpled in her hand. "That sounds incredibly lonely." Eleanor did not answer. She could not argue with the truth. It was lonely. The discipline of the warrior was a solitary path. Silas Vance had walked it until the day he died. He had walked it with a quiet dignity that commanded absolute respect. Eleanor was trying to walk in his footprints, but the boots were heavy, and the road was growing darker. "He tripped me because he was bored," Beatrice whispered, the tears threatening to spill again. "He tripped me because I'm broken, and he knew I couldn't get up fast enough to stop everyone from seeing it. He did it because he could." Eleanor felt a cold, hard knot tighten in her stomach. It was a familiar feeling. It was the feeling she got right before a sparring match. It was the biological preparation for conflict. Adrenaline, focus, the narrowing of the visual field. She looked at Beatrice's heavy steel brace. She looked at the bruised pride in the girl's eyes. "You are not broken, Beatrice," Eleanor said. Her voice carried a low, resonant authority that sounded exactly like Silas Vance addressing a platoon of fresh recruits. "You are carrying a heavier load than the rest of them. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you stronger. It just requires different mechanics." Eleanor stood up. She picked up the rubber-tipped crutch and held it out. "Stand up," Eleanor commanded quietly. Beatrice looked at the crutch, then at Eleanor. She gripped the rubber handle. She braced her good leg. She pushed upward, the steel joints of her brace clicking loudly as they locked into place. Good, Eleanor said. She adjusted the strap of her faded backpack. We have history class in 4 minutes. We are not going to be late. And we are going to walk through the front doors of that classroom, not the back. Beatrice took a deep breath. She tightened her grip on the crutch. For the first time that day, the crushing weight on her shoulders felt fractionally lighter. She looked at the quiet girl beside her, realizing that Eleanor Vance was not a victim. She was a vault. And whatever was locked inside that vault was far more dangerous than anything Montgomery Sinclair could ever muster. The friendship forged on that concrete step was not built on shared interests or teenage gossip. It was built on a mutual understanding of survival. They became a silent unit of two. When Beatrice walked down the crowded hallways, the mechanical clicking of her brace acting as a metronome, Eleanor walked half a step behind her and slightly to the left. It was the wingman position. It was a physical barrier between Beatrice and the unpredictable currents of the student body. Eleanor did not push people out of the way. She simply occupied space with such absolute, unyielding density that the crowd instinctively parted around her. She was a boulder in a rushing river. The water had no choice but to flow around the stone. Montgomery Sinclair noticed the shift. He noticed that his primary target, the quiet girl with the stoic face, had attached herself to the crippled girl. He sat in his leather chair in the student lounge, bouncing a tennis ball against the cinder block wall. His eyes narrowed in calculation. Montgomery was a predator who relied on isolation. He liked to separate the weak from the herd. The fact that Eleanor had aligned herself with Beatrice irritated him. It was a defiance of his social order. If he could not break Eleanor through direct assault, he would break her by destroying the perimeter she had established. He would go after the structural weakness. He would go after the steel brace. The weather turned bitterly cold as November settled over Oak Creek. The skies were a perpetual, bruised purple. The wind howled through the cracked window frames of the aging high school. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to mirror the growing tension in the hallways. The escalation began subtly. It started in the school library. Eleanor and Beatrice were sitting at a heavy oak table near the back shelves. The air smelled of old paper and floor wax. Beatrice was meticulously copying notes for an upcoming biology exam. Eleanor was reading a dense volume on military strategy. The heavy wooden doors of the library swung open. Montgomery walked in, flanked by his two permanent shadows, Chase and Wyatt. They did not belong in the library. Their presence instantly altered the barometric pressure of the room. The librarian, a timid woman nearing retirement, instinctively busied herself behind the circulation desk, avoiding eye contact. Montgomery scanned the room. His eyes locked onto the back corner. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He sauntered over. His athletic shoes squeaked loudly against the polished floor, intentionally breaking the mandated silence. He stopped right behind Beatrice's chair. Eleanor did not look up from her book, but her sensory perimeter expanded. She tracked his breathing. She mapped the distance between his hand and Beatrice's shoulder. She calculated the trajectory required to disable his knee joint if he made a threatening move. Montgomery leaned forward. He rested his hands on the back of Beatrice's wooden chair. He began to rock it gently, back and forth. The movement jarred Beatrice's writing. Her pen slipped, leaving a dark, jagged line across her perfectly organized notes. She stiffened. Her breathing hitched. "Studying hard, Caldwell?" Montgomery whispered. His voice was too loud for the library, carrying a mocking, theatrical tone. "Gotta keep the brains sharp since the legs don't work, right?" Chase and Wyatt snickered from the aisle. Beatrice kept her head down. She gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. She tried to focus on the biological diagram of a cell, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. Montgomery rocked the chair a little harder. The front legs lifted off the ground. Beatrice gasped softly and grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table to steady herself. "Careful now," Montgomery taunted. "Don't want you taking another spill. Might dent the floor." Across the table, Eleanor slowly closed her book. The sound was not loud, but the absolute finality of it cut through Montgomery's taunting like a blade. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the table. She lifted her head. She looked at Montgomery. It was the same slate-gray stare she had given him by the lockers weeks ago. But this time, the temperature of the stare had plummeted. It was absolute zero. It was the look of a sniper acquiring a target through a high-powered scope. "Remove your hands from her chair," Eleanor said. Her voice was not a shout. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. It carried the chilling, unquestionable authority of a commanding officer delivering an order. Montgomery's smile faltered. His hands froze on the back of the chair. He looked at Eleanor, trying to find the bluff in her eyes. He found none. He found only a dark, bottomless promise of consequence. For a long, agonizing moment, the library was perfectly still. The silence was thick enough to choke on. The air crackled with kinetic energy, waiting to be released. Eleanor's muscles were coiled. Her feet were planted firmly on the floor. If Montgomery pushed the chair forward, she would launch over the table. She would bypass his guards. She would drive the heel of her palm upward into his jaw hinge, dislocating it instantly. It would take exactly 1.2 seconds. She felt the cold metal of the dog tags pressing into her chest. Only to protect. Beatrice was in distress, but she was not in physical danger. The threshold had not been crossed. The oath held Eleanor back, invisible chains wrapping around her wrists. Montgomery felt the shift. He couldn't define it, but his primal instincts told him he was standing too close to the edge of a very steep cliff. He slowly lifted his hands off the wooden chair. He stepped back, raising his palms in a mock gesture of surrender. "Relax, Vance," Montgomery sneered, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "Just making sure the furniture is sturdy. We'd want a liability lawsuit." He turned on his heel and walked away, Chase and Wyatt following closely behind, glancing nervously over their shoulders at the quiet girl sitting at the table. Beatrice exhaled a long, shaky breath. She dropped her pen. Her hands were trembling violently. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking, I can't keep doing this. I can't be his entertainment." Eleanor looked at her friend. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around Beatrice's eyes. The psychological warfare was working. Montgomery was slowly dismantling Beatrice's spirit, piece by piece. "He is a coward, Beatrice," Eleanor said softly. "He attacks the structure because he is terrified of the foundation." "My foundation is a metal brace," Beatrice replied bitterly. "It's not exactly impenetrable." "Your foundation is your mind," Eleanor corrected her. "The brace is just hardware. Hardware can be broken. The mind is a fortress. Do not let him breach the gates." But as Eleanor packed up her bag that afternoon, the words tasted hollow in her mouth. She was giving tactical advice to a civilian. Beatrice was not a Marine. She was a 16-year-old girl who just wanted to learn biology without being treated like a broken toy. The burden of restraint was becoming unbearable. That night, the small rented house was quiet. The wind rattled the window panes in their wooden frames. Eleanor stood in the center of the detached, unheated garage. The air was freezing, her breath plumed in white clouds under the single, swaying utility bulb. Suspended from a reinforced steel beam was a heavy canvas punching bag. It was worn smooth in the center from thousands of impacts. It was a relic from her father's life. It was the altar where she prayed. She was wearing a thick gray sweatshirt and heavy canvas pants. Her hands were wrapped meticulously in white cotton tape. Left over right, secure the wrist, protect the knuckles. A ritual of preparation. She approached the heavy bag. She bowed her head for a fraction of a second. a sign of respect for the discipline. Then she exploded. A sharp, snapping left jab buried itself deep into the canvas. Thwack! She pivoted on her back foot, driving her hips forward, unleashing a devastating right cross. Thwack! The heavy bag swung backward, the chains groaning in protest against the steel beam. Eleanor did not wait for it to return. She stepped inside the arc. Left hook to the body, right uppercut, a devastating front kick that snapped like a bullwhip, driving the bag upward and backward with violent force. The sound of the impacts echoed like gunfire in the small garage. It was a chaotic symphony of controlled violence. Every strike was perfectly executed. Perfect form, maximum power transfer, zero wasted motion. She was not fighting the bag. She was fighting the ghost of Montgomery Sinclair. She was fighting the smirking face, the cowardly foot sweeping out from under a table, the heavy hands resting on a wooden chair. She hit the bag harder. The skin on her knuckles began to sting beneath the cotton wraps. The sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the freezing air. Thwack! 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 She saw Beatrice falling. She saw the spilled milk. She heard the cruel, echoing laughter. Patience is a weapon, Eleanor. Her father's voice pierced through the rhythmic thumping of the bag. It was loud. It was clear. It sounded as if Silas Vance was standing right behind her in the freezing shadows of the garage. Eleanor stopped. She caught the swinging heavy bag with both gloves, absorbing its momentum until it hung perfectly still. She stood there, her chest heaving, the white clouds of her breath illuminated by the swaying bulb. She remembered a specific night. She had been 12 years old. Silas had been watching a news report about a foreign conflict. Innocent people were suffering while powerful nations debated protocols. Silas had turned off the television. His face had been grim, carved from old granite. "There are two types of danger in this world, El," he had said, staring at the blank screen. "The danger of action and the danger of inaction. They teach you that restraint is a virtue, and it is, up to a point. But when the wolf is in the pasture, and the shepherd chooses to sit on his hands because the wolf hasn't bitten him yet, the shepherd is no longer peaceful. The shepherd is complicit." Eleanor pressed her forehead against the rough canvas of the heavy bag. It smelled of dust and old sweat. "The shepherd is complicit," she whispered to the empty garage. She unwrapped her hands. The cotton tape was damp. She walked back into the small house. She went to the oak dresser. She looked at the folded American flag. She looked at the silver chain resting on top of it. She picked up the dog tags. The metal was cold. She had promised him she would never use her training to hurt anyone, unless it was to protect the helpless. She had interpreted that as a physical mandate. She had waited for a fist to be thrown. She had waited for a weapon to be drawn. She had waited for a life or death scenario to justify unleashing the weapon she had become. But Silas Vance had not taught her to be a machine. He had taught her to be a protector. Montgomery Sinclair was not going to throw a punch. He was a coward. He was going to use his power to crush Beatrice Caldwell's spirit until there was nothing left but dust. He was going to break her from the inside out. The wolf was in the pasture. The wolf was tearing at the sheep. And Eleanor was standing perfectly still, watching it happen, holding on to a vow of restraint that had become an excuse for inaction. She gripped the dog tags in her fist. The rules of engagement had to change. She could no longer be a ghost. She could no longer be a shield. A shield only mitigated damage. A shield did not stop the attack. To stop the attack, she had to become the sword. She slipped the chain over her head. The metal tags settled against her chest. They did not feel like a burden anymore. They felt like armor. The next morning, the skies over Oak Creek were the color of bruised iron. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. A hard, bitter frost coated the cracked sidewalks. Eleanor walked to school. Her stride was exactly the same, heel to toe, shoulders back, chin level. But the internal engine had shifted gears. The tactical retreat was over. The counter-offensive had begun. She arrived at the courtyard. The buses rumbled. The students swarmed. Eleanor did not look for an empty path. She walked directly through the center of the crowd. The density of her presence was palpable. It was no longer the quiet avoidance of a boulder in a stream. It was the undeniable force of an icebreaker cutting through a frozen sea. She found Beatrice at her locker. The smaller girl looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her brown eyes. The mechanical brace looked heavier than usual today. "Morning," Beatrice said, her voice lacking its usual brightness. "Morning," Eleanor replied. She opened her locker. She placed her bag inside. She did not take out her books. She closed the metal door with a solid, echoing slam. "You okay?" Beatrice asked, noticing the intensity in Eleanor's movements. "I am operating at peak efficiency," Eleanor stated. "We need to alter our route today." "Why?" "Because walking the perimeter is no longer a viable strategy," Eleanor said. She looked down the long hallway. At the far end, Montgomery Sinclair was standing with his group, leaning against the wall, laughing loudly. "Eleanor, no," Beatrice said, panic rising in her chest. She grabbed Eleanor's sleeve. "Please, don't look at him. Don't engage. It will just make it worse." Eleanor looked down at Beatrice's hand. She reached over and gently detached the smaller girl's fingers from her jacket. "It cannot get worse, Beatrice," Eleanor said quietly. "It can only reach a conclusion. The longer a wound is left open, the deeper the infection spreads. It is time to cauterize." The warning bell rang, a harsh electric buzz that vibrated through the floorboards. The hallway began to clear as students scrambled toward their homerooms. Montgomery pushed off the wall. He began walking down the corridor, right down the center, expecting the sea to part for him as it always did. Eleanor stepped into the center of the hallway. She did not stand to the side. She did not drop her eyes. She stood directly in his path. She planted her boots on the linoleum. She squared her shoulders. She locked her gaze onto his face. She was a barricade. Montgomery saw her. He stopped. He was 20 feet away. Chase and Wyatt bumped into him from behind, confused by the sudden halt. Montgomery looked at Eleanor. He looked at the rigid set of her posture. He looked at the slate-gray eyes that stared at him with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a predator that had finally decided to strike. The arrogant smirk melted off his face. For the first time since she had arrived at Oak Creek High, Montgomery Sinclair felt a genuine spike of fear shoot up his spine. It was an instinctual reaction. His brain recognized a threat that his ego could not comprehend. The hallway was suddenly very quiet. The stragglers stopped walking. They pressed themselves against the lockers. They watched. Montgomery tried to recover. He forced the smirk back onto his lips. He rolled his shoulders and took a step forward. He was going to push through her. He was going to bump her shoulder harder than ever before. He was going to reestablish his dominance. He closed the distance. 10 feet. 5 feet. Eleanor did not move. She did not brace for impact. She simply existed in that space with absolute, immovable certainty. Montgomery raised his shoulder. He leaned his considerable weight forward, aiming directly for her collarbone. At the absolute last fraction of a second, Eleanor shifted. It was not a flinch. It was a micro-adjustment, a pivot of the hips, a slight drop in her center of gravity. Montgomery's heavy shoulder brushed past her worn canvas jacket, hitting nothing but empty air. The momentum carried him forward, his balance completely compromised. He stumbled awkwardly, his expensive athletic shoes squeaking frantically against the linoleum as he fought to keep from falling flat on his face. He caught himself against a row of lockers with a loud metallic crash. A collective gasp echoed down the hallway. Eleanor did not look back at him. She did not smile. She did not utter a single word of triumph. She maintained her forward momentum, her stride unbroken, her focus absolute. She had not touched him. She had not raised a hand, but she had completely shattered his physical authority in front of half the senior class. Montgomery spun around. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The humiliation burned through his veins like battery acid. The illusion of his power had been fractured, and he knew that everyone in that hallway had seen it. "You're dead, Vance," he roared. The sound echoed off the cinder block walls. It was the desperate, ugly sound of a cornered animal. "You hear me? You're done." Eleanor kept walking. She did not acknowledge the threat. A threat was just noise, and Eleanor Vance had been trained to ignore the noise. She reached the end of the hallway, turned the corner, and disappeared from his sight. The gauntlet had been thrown. The Cold War was over. The physical confrontation was now inevitable. Montgomery Sinclair stood trembling by the lockers. His fists clenched so tight his fingernails dug into his palms. He could not let this stand. He could not allow a quiet girl with scuffed boots to dismantle his kingdom. He needed to destroy her. But he knew instinctively that attacking her directly was dangerous. The way she had moved, it was unnatural. It was too fast, too controlled. He looked down the hallway. Beatrice Caldwell was still standing by her locker, leaning heavily on her crutch, her eyes wide with shock. A dark, venomous idea crystallized in Montgomery's mind. Eleanor Vance thought she was a protector. She thought she was untouchable. He would show her what happened when a protector failed. He would show her the true cost of defiance. He wouldn't just break Beatrice this time. He would shatter her right in front of Eleanor's stoic, unblinking eyes. He would make the quiet girl watch as her only friend was humiliated beyond repair. The collision course was set. The pressure cooker was sealed. The heat was rising. Friday was approaching, the end of the week, the day the cafeteria became the loudest, most chaotic arena in the school, the perfect stage for a public execution. Eleanor sat in her history class. The teacher was droning on about the fall of empires. Eleanor stared out the window at the gray, freezing sky. Her hand rested flat on her desk. Beneath her shirt, the cold metal of the dog tags pressed against her heart. She could feel the storm gathering. She could feel the barometric pressure dropping in the hallways. Silas Vance's words echoed in the silent chambers of her mind, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat preparing her for the final breach. Control your body before your anger controls you. Never strike out of pride. Only strike to protect. And when you strike, you do not hesitate. You eliminate the threat with absolute prejudice. The long wait was over. The discipline of inaction had served its purpose. It was time for the discipline of the sword. The quiet girl was dead. The Marine's daughter had awakened. Friday arrived with the heavy, uncompromising chill of deep November. The sky over Oak Creek was a flat, bruised sheet of iron, threatening snow but delivering only a biting wind that rattled the loose window frames of the aging high school. It was the end of the week. In the ecosystem of the American high school, Friday was the day the pressure valves released. The energy in the hallways was always different on a Friday. It was louder, more frantic, vibrating with the anticipation of 2 days of freedom. For Eleanor Vance, Friday held no such promise. It was simply another 24-hour cycle, another tactical deployment. She woke in the freezing darkness of her small bedroom. She went through her morning routine with the silent, mechanical precision of a soldier preparing for a patrol in hostile territory. She dressed in her standard uniform, the faded denim, the sturdy leather boots, the oversized canvas jacket. She stood before the small oak dresser. She looked at the folded American flag resting on the wood. She picked up the silver chain. The metal of the dog tags was ice cold against her fingertips. She closed her eyes and let the weight of them ground her. The hardest battle a man can fight is the one against his own instincts, Elle. Silas Vance's voice drifted through the quiet room. It was a memory from a humid summer evening. They had been sitting on the porch of their base housing, listening to the cicadas hum in the tall grass. He had been cleaning his boots with meticulous care. Your body wants to strike when it is threatened. Your ego wants to destroy when it is insulted. But you are not an animal. You are a human being. You are a Marine's daughter. You do not react. You respond. And you only respond when the cost of doing nothing is higher than the cost of going to war. Eleanor slipped the chain over her head. The cold metal settled heavily against her chest, right over her heart. The cost of doing nothing had become too high. The infection was spreading. Montgomery Sinclair had realized that he could not break Eleanor's stoic perimeter directly. His physical intimidation had failed. His verbal assaults had evaporated against her silence. He had been humiliated in the hallway, his authority publicly challenged by a girl who had simply refused to move out of his way. A cornered predator does not retreat. It finds a softer target. Eleanor knew Montgomery was going to strike. She could read the shift in his baseline behavior. He was too quiet yesterday. He had stopped throwing crumpled paper. He had stopped the loud, mocking insults from across the classroom. He was conserving his energy. He was planning an ambush. And Eleanor knew exactly who the target of that ambush would be. She walked the 2 miles to school. The frost crunched under the heavy soles of her boots. Her breath hung in the air like pale smoke. She did not listen to music. She did not look at a phone. She observed the horizon. She calculated the distance between the bare oak trees. She measured the speed of the passing cars. She was calibrating her sensory input, sharpening the tools she had kept locked away in a dark box for 2 years. When she entered the main doors of Oak Creek High, the noise washed over her. It was a chaotic wall of sound, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished linoleum, shouts, laughter, the frantic, disorganized energy of youth. She found Beatrice Caldwell at her locker. The smaller girl looked incredibly fragile this morning. The heavy steel and leather brace on her left leg seemed to weigh her down more than usual. Her shoulders were slumped. Her bright brown eyes were clouded with anxiety. "He's staring," Beatrice whispered, not looking up as Eleanor approached. Eleanor did not turn her head. She used her peripheral vision. 50 yards down the hallway, standing near the trophy cases, was Montgomery Sinclair. He was flanked by Chase and Wyatt. They were not laughing today. They were watching. Montgomery's eyes were locked onto Beatrice. It was the cold, dead stare of a hunter tracking a wounded deer. "Let him stare," Eleanor said. Her voice was a low, steady rumble, devoid of any emotional fluctuation. A stare cannot break bone. A stare cannot draw blood. It is just a psychological tactic. Ignore it. "I can't." Beatrice's voice trembled. Her hands shook as she tried to force a heavy textbook into her locker. "Eleanor, I can't do this anymore. Every time I walk down the hall, I'm just waiting for the foot to shoot out. I'm waiting for the push. I can't breathe in this building." Eleanor reached out. She placed her calloused hand over Beatrice's trembling fingers. The movement stopped. "You will breathe," Eleanor commanded quietly. "You will stand tall. You will not give him the satisfaction of your fear. He feeds on it. Starve him." The morning classes dragged on with agonizing slowness. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy, suffocating humidity that preceded a violent thunderstorm. Eleanor sat through mathematics and history with perfect posture, her eyes on the chalkboard, her mind mapping the architecture of the school. She mentally calculated the blind spots in the hallways. She noted the distance between the cafeteria tables. She was running tactical simulations, preparing for the inevitable engagement. Then came the hour of reckoning. Lunch. Friday was the day everyone waited for. The cafeteria buzzed with 1,000 conversations, an overwhelming cacophony of adolescent life. The massive room was a sea of plastic tables, fluorescent lights, and the heavy smell of institutional food. It was the social epicenter of Oak Creek High. It was the arena where reputations were forged and destroyed in broad daylight. Eleanor and Beatrice walked through the double doors. The mechanical clicking of Beatrice's brace was drowned out by the sheer volume of the room. They navigated the crowded aisles, heading toward their usual table in the back corner, near the loading dock doors. the safe zone, the perimeter. Eleanor walked point. She cleared the path. She moved with a slow, deliberate density that forced the rushing students to part around her. Beatrice followed closely behind, leaning heavily on her rubber-tipped crutch, her eyes glued to the floor tiles. They reached the table. They sat down. Eleanor unpacked her simple, foil-wrapped sandwich. Beatrice stared blankly at her plastic tray of school food. Neither of them had an appetite. Across the vast room, sitting at the largest table in the exact center of the cafeteria, Montgomery Sinclair watched them. He had not started eating. He was leaning back in his plastic chair, his arms crossed over his chest. Chase and Wyatt sat on either side of him, acting as heavy anchors for his bruised ego. Montgomery's jaw was set. His eyes were dark. The humiliation of the hallway incident had festered all night. He needed a public restoration of his power. He needed the entire school to see that he was untouchable. And he needed Eleanor Vance to break. He stood up. The movement was abrupt. It caught the attention of the surrounding tables. The laughter in his immediate vicinity died down. Chase and Wyatt stood up immediately, falling into step behind him. Montgomery began to walk across the cafeteria. He did not walk with his usual swagger. He walked with a heavy, purposeful aggression. He was a missile locked onto a coordinate. He bypassed the athletic tables. He bypassed the cheerleaders. He walked straight down the center aisle, heading directly for the back corner. Eleanor saw him coming. She did not stop chewing her sandwich. She did not reach for her backpack. She simply shifted her weight in the plastic chair. She planted her feet flat on the linoleum floor. She aligned her spine. She took a slow, deep breath in through her nose, holding it for a 4 count, letting it out through her mouth. She was regulating her heart rate. She was bringing the chaotic noise of the cafeteria down to a dull, manageable hum. "Eleanor," Beatrice whispered. Her voice was a terrified squeak. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. "Keep your eyes on your tray," Eleanor instructed softly. "Do not look at him." Montgomery reached the table. He did not stop at a polite distance. He closed the gap completely, standing towering over their small table, casting a long, dark shadow over their food. Chase and Wyatt flanked him, crossing their arms, trying to look intimidating. The ambient noise in the back half of the cafeteria began to drop. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. The invisible social gravity of the school was pulling an audience to the impending execution. Montgomery placed both of his large hands flat on the edge of their table. He leaned his upper body forward. He was intentionally invading their airspace. He was using his physical size to create a suffocating pressure. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked up. Her slate gray eyes met his. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no anger. There was only a cold, terrifying emptiness. It was the look of a stone wall facing a strong wind. The wind can blow all day, but the stone does not care. "You think you're pretty tough, don't you, Vance?" Montgomery said. His voice was low, vibrating with suppressed rage. It was loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, but quiet enough to sound menacing. Eleanor did not answer. She maintained eye contact, unblinking. "You think you can just walk through my halls and act like you own the place?" Montgomery continued, his knuckles turning white as he pressed his weight into the table. "You think you can disrespect me in front of my friends and just walk away?" The silence from Eleanor was deafening. It was a weaponized silence. It gave Montgomery absolutely nothing to work with. It was a mirror reflecting his own profound insecurity back at him. Montgomery's jaw clenched. The veins in his thick neck stood out. The lack of reaction was infuriating him. He needed her to yell. He needed her to flinch. He needed her to show any sign of weakness. "Are you mute, freak?" Chase chimed in from the side, trying to impress his leader. Eleanor's eyes flicked to Chase for a fraction of a second, registering his position, his weight distribution, and his level of threat. Minimal. She returned her gaze to Montgomery. I asked you a question, Montgomery snarled. He needed to force a reaction. He shifted his tactic. He looked away from Eleanor's impenetrable stare and turned his attention to the trembling girl sitting next to her. He looked at Beatrice. He looked at the heavy steel brace clamped around her left leg. A cruel, ugly smile twisted his lips. Maybe you're just quiet because you have to spend all your time babysitting the defective merchandise, Montgomery said loudly. Beatrice flinched as if she had been struck across the face. A quiet gasp escaped her lips. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Eleanor's breathing stopped. The temperature at the table dropped to absolute zero. The invisible perimeter Eleanor had maintained for months suddenly vanished. The tactical retreat was officially over. The rules of engagement had just been rewritten. Montgomery saw the micro-expression flash across Eleanor's face. He saw the slight tightening of her jaw. He saw the infinitesimal shift in her shoulders. He thought he had found the crack in the armor. He thought he had won. He decided to press the advantage. He decided to turn the psychological torture into physical humiliation. Montgomery reached out. His large hand clamped heavily onto Eleanor's shoulder. It was a hard, aggressive shove, designed to knock her off balance. He shoved her backward. The plastic chair screeched violently against the linoleum. Eleanor's back hit the cinder block wall behind her. The small cafeteria tray in front of her slid forward, spilling her water bottle and scattering her food across the table. The sound of the chair scraping was loud. It cut through the remaining noise in the cafeteria like a gunshot. The entire room went absolutely silent. Hundreds of teenage conversations ceased simultaneously. Every single eye turned toward the back corner. The air became thick, heavy with the electric anticipation of violence. Beatrice's eyes snapped open. She saw Eleanor hit the wall. A surge of desperate, uncharacteristic courage flared in the smaller girl's chest. She could not sit there and watch the only person who had ever protected her be attacked. Beatrice grabbed her crutch. She tried to stand up. The steel joints of her brace clicked loudly in the silent room. "Leave her alone," Beatrice yelled. Her voice cracked, terrified but defiant. She took a clumsy step forward, raising her hand to push Montgomery away from the table. It was a mistake. Montgomery Sinclair was operating purely on bruised ego and adrenaline. He did not see a disabled girl trying to help her friend. He saw another challenge to his authority. He saw an insect buzzing around his face. Before Beatrice could even fully stand, Montgomery turned his massive frame. He swung his arm out in a brutal, sweeping motion. His heavy hand struck Beatrice squarely in the chest. It was not a playful push. It was a violent, forceful shove from a varsity athlete. The impact lifted Beatrice completely off her good foot. Her crutch flew out of her hand, clattering noisily across the floor. Beatrice went down hard. Her heavy brace slammed against the unforgiving linoleum. Her head whipped backward, narrowly missing the edge of the metal table legs. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips as the air was forced from her lungs. A collective gasp echoed through the massive room. Several students stood up from their tables. The line between high school bullying and actual assault had just been crossed in front of 500 witnesses. Chase and Wyatt took a sudden step back. This was not the plan. This was not throwing paper or tripping someone in the hall. This was ugly. Montgomery stood over Beatrice's crumpled form, his chest heaving. For a split second, a flash of genuine panic crossed his face. He had lost control. But his ego quickly suffocated the panic. He looked down at the girl on the floor, trying to mask his fear with a sneer. He opened his mouth to speak. He never got the chance. Behind him, Eleanor Vance stood up. She did not scramble. She did not rush. She rose from the plastic chair with a slow, terrifying fluidity. Her back straightened, aligning perfectly. Her shoulders squared. The quiet girl with the faded backpack was gone. In her place stood the physical manifestation of Silas Vance's legacy. She was a weapon that had just been unsealed. Eleanor stepped out from behind the table. She looked down at Beatrice, who was clutching her chest, tears streaming down her face. She saw the pain in her friend's eyes. She saw the heavy brace twisted awkwardly on the floor. She reached up. Her fingers found the silver chain around her neck. She gripped the metal dog tags, only to protect the helpless. The oath had been fulfilled. The parameter had been breached. The safety was off. Eleanor turned her head. She locked her unblinking gaze onto Montgomery Sinclair. The cafeteria was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent tubes overhead. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum waiting to implode. Montgomery turned to face her. The panic he had tried to suppress flooded back into his system tenfold. The girl standing in front of him did not look like a high school student. She looked like a professional soldier staring down a hostile combatant. Her eyes were completely devoid of human warmth. They were the eyes of an apex predator executing a biological imperative. Montgomery tried to project dominance. He puffed out his chest. He balled his hands into heavy fists. He tried to force a laugh, but the sound died in his throat. It came out as a hollow, pathetic wheeze. "What?" Montgomery spat, his voice shaking slightly. "You going to do something about it, freak?" Eleanor took one measured step forward. "You have been looking for a fight since the day I arrived," Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant acoustic density that carried to the farthest corners of the silent cafeteria. It was a voice of absolute, deadly calm. "You finally found one." Chase, sensing his leader's hesitation, decided to intervene. He was larger than Montgomery, built like a brick wall. He stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, a confident smirk on his face. "Oh, please," Chase chuckled, stepping between Eleanor and Montgomery. "You can't possibly—" He never finished the sentence. Eleanor moved. To the untrained eyes of the high school audience, it looked like a blur of motion. It was too fast for the human brain to process in real time. It was not the wide, looping punches of a street fight. It was the surgical application of physics and biomechanics. It was thousands of hours of repetitive muscle memory executing a precise command. Chase reached out with his massive right hand, aiming to grab her canvas jacket. Eleanor did not retreat. She stepped inside his reach. She parried his heavy arm away with her left forearm, deflecting his kinetic energy harmlessly to the side. Simultaneously, her right hand shot forward like a piston. She did not strike his face. That would break skin, cause bleeding, create unnecessary damage. She drove the heel of her palm upward, striking the soft tissue just below his ribcage, directly into the solar plexus. The impact was short, sharp, and devastating. All the air rushed out of Chase's lungs in a violent hiss. His eyes rolled back in his head. His legs turned to water. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his stomach, entirely incapacitated in less than 1 second. Montgomery stared in absolute horror. The brick wall had just crumbled. His brain bypassed rational thought and went straight into fight or flight. Unfortunately for him, his ego chose fight. Montgomery roared. He lunged forward, throwing a wild, desperate right hook aimed directly at Eleanor's head. It was a punch fueled by panic and rage, carrying all of his 200 pounds behind it. If it had connected, it would have been catastrophic. Eleanor did not blink. She watched the punch coming in slow motion. She saw the telegraphing in his shoulder. She saw the overcommitment in his hips. As the heavy fist sailed toward her face, Eleanor executed a flawless slip. She dropped her center of gravity by 3 inches and pivoted on her lead foot. Montgomery's fist grazed the empty air where her head had been a microsecond before. His momentum carried him violently forward, completely off balance. Eleanor capitalized instantly. She stepped behind his extended lead leg. She brought her right arm up, wrapping it tightly around the back of his neck, locking him into a standing clinch. She used his own forward momentum against him, applying downward pressure on his neck while simultaneously hooking her right foot behind his left ankle. It was a textbook leg sweep, perfect leverage, maximum efficiency. Eleanor twisted her torso. Montgomery's feet left the linoleum. He was airborne for a fraction of a second, his face a mask of bewildered terror before gravity reclaimed him. Montgomery Sinclair hit the ground hard. The impact sounded like a sack of wet cement being dropped from a two-story window. The breath exploded from his lungs. The back of his head bounced off the polished tiles. He lay there, staring blindly at the fluorescent lights, his brain struggling to comprehend how he had gone from apex predator to floor mat in less than 3 seconds. Wyatt, the third and final member of the gang, stood completely frozen. His eyes were wide with sudden, paralyzing fear. He looked at Chase, gasping for air on his knees. He looked at Montgomery, staring blankly at the ceiling. He looked at the quiet girl in the worn canvas jacket, who had not even broken a sweat. Eleanor turned her gaze slowly toward Wyatt. Wyatt raised both hands in the air, slowly backing away, shaking his head frantically. He wanted absolutely no part of this. The entire cafeteria remained dead silent. The shock was absolute. The untouchable king of Oak Creek High had been dismantled with effortless, terrifying precision. Dozens of cell phones were out, their red recording lights blinking, capturing the unbelievable scene. Eleanor did not celebrate. She did not stand over Montgomery and gloat. There was no pride in what she had just done. There was only the grim satisfaction of a completed objective. She looked down at Montgomery. The arrogant star athlete was groaning softly, trying to roll over onto his side. The illusion of his power was permanently shattered. Eleanor took a step closer. She stood over him. "I do not like hurting people," Eleanor said. Her voice cut through the silence, steady, clear, and deeply resonant. "I despise violence, but you made the mistake of believing that my restraint was an inability to act." She knelt down slightly, ensuring he could hear every word. "Do not ever mistake kindness for weakness," she commanded, "and do not ever lay your hands on her again." She stood up. She looked at Montgomery's face. He was staring up at her, expecting a final blow, expecting the cruelty he would have dealt if the roles were reversed. But Eleanor did not strike him. She looked at him, and the cold emptiness in her eyes was replaced by something much worse. It was pity. "You were given every advantage," Eleanor said softly, the disappointment heavy in her tone. "You have strength. You have influence. You could be a protector. You could be better than this, much better." Montgomery blinked, the words cutting deeper than the physical pain of his fall. "You just choose not to be," Eleanor finished. She turned her back on him. She dismissed him completely. He was no longer a threat. He was just a boy on the floor. Eleanor walked over to where Beatrice was sitting on the ground. The smaller girl was staring at Eleanor with wide, disbelieving eyes. She had known Eleanor was strong, but she had never comprehended this level of absolute, disciplined power. Eleanor reached down. She picked up the rubber-tipped crutch and held it in her left hand. She extended her right hand to Beatrice. "Stand up," Eleanor said gently. The military command was gone. It was just the voice of a friend. Beatrice took the offered hand. Eleanor pulled her up effortlessly, stabilizing her until the heavy steel brace locked into place. Eleanor handed her the crutch. At the far end of the cafeteria, the heavy wooden doors burst open. 3 teachers and a school security guard rushed into the room, their faces pale, responding to the unnatural silence that had enveloped the cafeteria. "Hey, what is going on here?" the security guard shouted, pointing at the bodies on the floor. "Nobody move." Eleanor did not stop. She reached down and picked up her faded backpack from the floor. She slung it over her shoulder. She adjusted the collar of her jacket. She turned to Beatrice. "We are leaving," Eleanor stated. She placed her hand lightly on the small of Beatrice's back, guiding her forward. They began to walk down the center aisle of the cafeteria. The teachers rushed past them, yelling for order, kneeling down next to Montgomery and Chase. The chaos of authority was descending, but Eleanor walked right through it. She moved with the calm, measured stride of a civilian walking through a park. The students parted for them. They backed away from the tables, creating a wide, unobstructed path. The stairs were no longer filled with judgment or mockery. They were filled with absolute, unadulterated respect. Eleanor Vance walked out of the double doors of the cafeteria as calmly as if nothing at all had happened. She walked out into the freezing November air. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face. She reached up and touched her chest. She felt the outline of the 2 metal dog tags through her shirt. She had broken her silence. She had unleashed the weapon. But she had kept her promise. Silas Vance was gone, but his legacy was standing tall on the concrete steps of Oak Creek High. The warrior's discipline had prevailed. The helpless had been protected. And the quiet strength of true character had spoken louder than any shouted insult ever could. Eleanor looked at Beatrice, who was walking beside her, her head held high for the first time in months. The mechanical clicking of the brace no longer sounded like a target. It sounded like the rhythm of survival. Eleanor took a deep breath of the cold air. The storm was over. The perimeter was secure. The watch continued.